In the early 20th century, oil production led to the rapid growth of Casper, Wyoming. Teapot Dome oil field, located just north of the city, brought the area into the national spotlight.
The Teapot Dome Scandal was probably the most significant presidential scandal in American history in the 20th century, up until Watergate anyway, because it implicated members of the cabinet. It certainly could have implicated President Harding had he lived, and it became a rather notorious event even today as they're preparing to sell off the Teapot Dome Naval Petroleum Reserve. Soon after the turn of the century, when the U.S. Navy was starting to shift from those very clunky coal-burning battleships in the fleet to oil-burning ships, it occurred to various officials in the government that we might run out of oil. And what is to happen if suddenly we're in the middle of a war with a fleet that's being powered by petroleum fired ships, and suddenly we don't have any oil? So the decision was made by the Department of the Navy to go out and find on public land some known oil reserves that were still on public land, set them aside from exploration and development, and in essence save them in case of some future need that the Navy might have in the event that there's a war and we run short on oil. The Teapot Dome oil field is located north of Casper, essentially in the center of Wyoming, roughly in the center of Wyoming. This is a structural map of the Salt Creek region of Wyoming. Here is the Salt Creek field. It was an active field at the time of the Teapot Dome affair. And here is Teapot Dome Naval Petroleum Reserve. You see it outlined here in yellow. Teapot Creek flows this way, and down here is the spot where Teapot Rock is located, and Teapot Rock, of course, is how the dome or the anticline got its name. The Navy selected that particular location, or the government selected that particular location, because very nearby was a very major oil field, the Salt Creek oil field, that was one of the largest oil producing fields in the entire United States, if not the world, in the early part of the 20th century. And so when this particular reserve was set aside, there was the belief that underneath this area that was named for this rock that looked like a teapot at one time. Nowadays it sort of looks like a chimney rock, but at one time it had a handle, it had a spout, and over the years, I think it was in the 1920s that the spout got broken off by a lightning strike, and then eventually the handle disappeared too from erosion. So now if you say, oh, it's up by Teapot Rock, people say, well, how does that look like a teapot? Well, it doesn't anymore, but it once was a teapot. On that location before 1920, that location was simply fenced off and left in the public domain and sort of watched over by officials from the Department of the Navy, with the expectation that the commercial developers would steer clear, of course, because this is federal land that we're talking about. Prior to 1921, Albert Fall was New Mexico's first U.S. Senator, and he had had a career in the Southwest as an oil developer, as a miner, as a more or less a land minerals prospector. And when Warren G. Harding was elected president in November of 1920, he announced that Albert Fall one of his poker playing buddies from the U.S. Senate would become his Secretary of the Interior. Now, what's interesting about the story is that Albert Fall did not have authority over the Teapot Dome Naval Petroleum Reserve because, of course, that was the property of the U.S. Navy. That reserve was like two in California, set aside by the Navy for their purposes. And so the Naval Secretary, also a poker playing buddy of Warren Harding, a fellow by the name of Edwin Denby, was somehow coaxed or convinced to transfer the authority over the Naval Petroleum Reserves, the three Naval Petroleum Reserves, to the Interior Department, where very handily Albert Fall had a plan. He was later convicted of accepting bribes from a couple of oil men for allowing them exclusive access to these Naval Petroleum Reserves. It was done under the table, and the evidence at Albert Fall's trial indicated that he had received substantial amounts of cash from Harry Sinclair and from Edward Doheny in exchange for allowing them this exclusive right to drill in an area that was essentially set aside for drilling. It was not to be drilled on. He was, in essence, doing what the Interior Department was specifically banned from doing, and that is leasing out those oil fields to anybody. And even worse, if they were to be leased out, they should have been leased out on a competitive basis. There was a man named Leslie Miller who was an independent oil man down in Cheyenne, and Leslie Miller started hearing all these rumors from his friends up around Casper that Sinclair Oil Company trucks were seen going in to the Teapot Dome Naval Petroleum Reserve. And it appeared as though they were going in there to actually do drilling and do oil exploration. And he was very curious about this because he thought, well, there are a lot of us in the business that would really love to have an opportunity to drill in Teapot Dome. And it happened that he was visiting with his old friend up in Sheridan, Senator John B. Kendrick. Kendrick was a Democrat who represented Wyoming in the Senate in those years, and he mentioned to Kendrick, can you look into this and see what's going on? Something is happening at Teapot Dome. When they would question Albert Fall as to how this occurred, Fall was very foggy about how this particular activity had gone on, and in essence, President Harding was obtuse about how this had all occurred. As time passed, and as the Senate started investigating the activities of Albert Fall and the Interior Department with respect to Teapot Dome, they discovered that Albert Fall had not issued any formal official opportunity for competitive bidding at Teapot Dome. Just suddenly there was this contract signed between the Interior Department and these two oil men on developing the resources on these in these naval petroleum reserves. There's a very interesting sort of legal aftermath of the conviction of Albert Fall for accepting bribes from these two oil guys. What happened was that the Sinclair's company that he organized, calling it the Mammoth Oil Company, the Mammoth Oil Company continued to develop the oil field at Teapot Dome and claimed that he had every right to do it because the contract that had been issued to him by the Interior Department was still a valid contract. Well, the federal government would have none of it because clearly this contract was obtained through fraud, through bribery, and so the federal government brought an action in district court in Wyoming. T. Blake Kennedy had a very, very contrarian view of how that contract was arrived at, apparently, because in his memoirs, T. Blake Kennedy claims that when that contract rescission case came up before his court, he took the position that a contract is a contract and it's sacrosanct. And unless there is overwhelming evidence to indicate that the contract was somehow obtained through fraud or through bribes, then it should be enforced. What we have here are copies of an unpublished manuscript written by T. Blake Kennedy. It's his autobiography that he wrote late in his judicial career. And the last paragraph, I think, sums it up, where he says, "I close this chapter with a suggestion of curiosity which has been continuously operating in my mind, involving the query as to whether or not, when Naval Petroleum Reserve Number 3 is eventually opened up, any substantial amount of oil will be found there. While it is largely speculation, I am of the opinion that a substantial portion of the oil in the formation, especially in the upper sands, will be found to have been drained off through the intense operation of the adjoining Salt Creek field." The Circuit Court of Appeals overturned T. Blake Kennedy's decision because they clearly found that there was bribery involved in obtaining that particular contract. And then on appeal by Sinclair to the and Mammoth Oil Company to the Supreme Court of the United States, the Supreme Court affirmed the judgment of the Circuit Court of Appeals and allowed for the government to rescind the Teapot Dome oil drilling contract with Mammoth Oil. There's always been a question as to how much President Harding knew about the Teapot Dome affair. Now, it's pretty clear that Albert Fall had to get President Harding's authority in order to shift jurisdiction from the Department of the Navy to the Department of the Interior. And Harding must have known that there was something untoward about that kind of a request and making that kind of a switch. But as I guess you could say good luck would have it in the case of Warren Harding, he traveled west the summer after this scandal started, questions started being asked about this scandal, traveled west, came through Wyoming, went up to Alaska, became the first president to visit Alaska, came down to San Francisco, and then promptly and rather suddenly died in San Francisco. Now, the investigation was just heating up at that point, and there were a lot of people who questioned whether or not Warren Harding had more direct information about this scandal than he had let on previously, because Albert Fall was so close to him personally, and so was Edwin Denby, the naval secretary. And so a lot of historians will always remain curious, I guess, as to how much did the president know and when did he know it. Fall became the first cabinet officer to be convicted of a felony while serving in the U.S. cabinet. I don't mean a pun here, but his fall from grace was pretty hard and pretty dramatic. He went off to federal prison. He eventually got out of federal prison, and in the early years of World War II, some 20 years after the Teapot Dome affair, he died in obscurity and in essentially poverty in El Paso, Texas. What happened at Teapot Dome was that the Mammoth Oil Company, Sinclair, was told to remove all of their materials, all of their trucks, suspend the drilling, and that's the way the Teapot Dome field sat for the next 80 years until the federal government started using it for various experimental drilling and various other energy-related projects I believe in the 1980s, significantly later than what one would have expected with an oil field of that scope and located where it was located, so close to very, very good producing oil fields.